In the middle of a battlefield burning with chaos, a desperate colonel had shouted for air support. "Send any jet we've got left." The skies had stayed silent until a cold, steady female voice cut through the static. Shadow 9 requesting clearance for strike. Every man in the room had frozen. That call sign belonged to Major Elena Ross, the A-10 pilot they had buried 2 years earlier. As soldiers on the ground looked up to see a lone jet breaking through the clouds, the colonel realized he was hearing a ghost, and what happened next would rewrite the meaning of duty, sacrifice, and honor forever. Smoke curled up from the valley like torn ribbons of night, thick and angry against the pale sky. Radios screamed with overlapping voices, men calling for air support, for God, for anyone listening. The colonel stood over the map table, jaw locked, the ground still trembling from distant blasts. "Send any jet we've got left," he barked, slamming his fist hard enough to rattle the metal cups. The operator swallowed, eyes darting to the empty flight board. "So, we've got nothing in range." The silence that followed was heavier than the shell fire outside. Then the static cracked again, soft at first, then clear and cold. Shadow 9 requesting clearance for strike. Every head turned. The colonel froze. That name wasn't supposed to exist. The pilot had died 2 years ago. He leaned toward the radio, heart hammering. "Repeat that call sign." The voice came back steady, calm, alive. On the radar, a single blip emerged from the north, rising through cloud cover. Seconds later the sound hit them. Deep, thunderous, the unmistakable growl of an A-10. The operators stared at each other in disbelief as the jet burst through the clouds, sunlight flashing off its battered wings like a memory refusing to die. The colonel's lips parted, but no order came. For the first time in years, he felt something close to faith. The ghost they'd buried was back in the sky, and war itself seemed to hold its breath. 2 years before that ghostly voice returned, Major Elena Ross had been the kind of pilot legends whispered about. She flew the A-10 like it was an extension of her heartbeat, low enough to feel the dust on her canopy and close enough to see the men she was saving. Her crew used to say she could make the aircraft dance, grace inside chaos, calm inside fire. On her last mission, she was ordered to protect a medevac convoy caught in enemy crossfire. The radio tapes later captured her last words. "One more pass and they're clear." The colonel, then her commanding officer, had told her to pull out. She didn't. A surface missile tore through her wing, and the explosion lit the mountains for miles. They found wreckage, not her. Within weeks, her name was carved in black stone alongside the fallen. The colonel stood at that ceremony with rain dripping off his hat brim, guilt clenching his chest like a fist. He'd signed the order that put her there. After that day, something in him turned to iron. No risks, no heroes, only rules. He told his men ghosts don't return, and he believed it, because believing otherwise hurt too much. Now, in that command tent, hearing Shadow 9 over the radio again, his past and present collided. Could it be her? Impossible. Yet the sound of that A-10 was too distinct, too human. Outside, soldiers trapped in the valley clung to their last minutes. The colonel knew what that jet could do. If it truly was Elena Ross, she might be their only chance. He gripped the edge of the table as the engine's growl deepened through the storm. The war had stolen her once. Maybe now, it was giving her back. The A-10 came screaming out of the clouds like thunder given wings. Its engines shook the valley, that deep growl soldiers called the sound of salvation. Dust and flame rolled across the ridgeline as the first burst of cannon fire tore through enemy armor. The men pinned below looked up through smoke in disbelief. "No way," one whispered. "That's our pattern. Low, left, pull climb at the ridge." Another swore he saw white tips on the wings, just like before. They called it a ghost because no one could survive that kind of flying. Not twice. Yet every move carried a signature they knew. She flew close enough that the shockwaves slapped helmets, close enough to see the shark teeth painted on the nose of her jet. In the command tent, staff officers shouted over one another. "She's unverified, sir. We don't have clearance for this pilot." The colonel said nothing. His eyes followed the radar sweep like a man watching his own heart monitor. "Shadow 9, Identify yourself. The radio crackled. Silence. Then her voice again, calm and deliberate. Marking hostile armor, north of convoy. Firing for the living. The phrase punched the air out of him. That was hers, her old mantra. Through the haze, he saw flashes of training days. Elena bent over flight maps, tracing terrain with steady fingers, saying, "If one heartbeat's left down there, I'm not done." He remembered her in the ready room, quiet when others joked, eyes always fixed on the photo of her squadron. She'd carried them all like family. Now she flew alone, breaking every rule he'd ever enforced, and yet, saving every soul trapped in that valley. His officers pleaded, "Sir, we have to order her down before command sees this." But the words wouldn't leave his throat. Watching her dive again through flak and smoke, he realized what she was doing wasn't defiance. It was devotion. The ghost they'd buried was fighting for the living once more. And for the first time in years, the colonel wondered if the rules he'd built his life on had cost him more than war itself. Between bursts of radio static, the story folds back a year, to the day they thought she died. Elena had survived the crash, barely. Her A-10 had gone down hard in a canyon beyond friendly reach, the cockpit torn open by shrapnel and fire. She woke in the wreckage, bones broken, bleeding into sand, enemy boots crunching closer. She didn't fire. She didn't scream. Instead, she whispered coordinates into her cracked radio, false ones, leading the pursuers away from the real medevac corridor she'd been protecting. When they found her, she said nothing. For weeks, she was a ghost in a prison without walls, watching convoys pass from behind wire and dust, refusing to reveal anything that might endanger those still flying. They tortured her for names, for routes, for codes she could have traded for her life. She gave them nothing but silence. Months later, under a thunderstorm that covered sound and sight, she escaped. Crawling through mud and shards of glass, she reached a ravine where a burnt-out convoy once stood. There she found the dog tags of the men she'd saved, buried them beneath a stone, and walked until her legs gave out. A medevac patrol finally spotted her, but when she returned to base, command refused to announce her survival. They said her presence would compromise ongoing operations. Her name was already carved in stone, and undoing it would expose too many lies. She was given a new file, a false discharge, and told to disappear. For a time, she did, until the reports came. A convoy ambushed in the same valley, the same route she had once died to protect. That night, Elena walked through a mothballed depot in the desert, flashlight beam trembling across forgotten aircraft. Her old A-10 sat there, stripped and silent. She ran her hand along its scarred frame, whispering, "One more flight." By dawn, she'd patched the hydraulics, swapped codes, and taken off under a false transponder. No authorization, no wingman, no call for glory, just duty. Now, as the colonel listens to her voice guiding troops out of the valley, he understands. Command didn't just bury her. They buried the truth of what loyalty looks like when orders end. He stays at the radio, the guilt crawling up his throat. She's risking everything again, not for medals or command, but for the living, because she always believed some things are worth breaking silence for. The sky above the valley erupted in a storm of smoke and steel. Elena's A-10 carved through it, wings trembling but steady, each burst of cannon fire a heartbeat in metal. The ground shook with every pass. Beati, a sound every soldier knew as hope. Cameras from helmet feeds and convoy dash units caught it all. One jet, moving like a hawk through flak, shredding armor piece by piece. Command screens filled with live footage, and disbelief spread like wildfire. The colonel ordered a direct feed, confirmation. The image sharpened through haze and fire. A close-up of the cockpit, oxygen mask, call sign tag, and eyes clear as winter. Major Elena Ross. No simulation, no ghost. She was alive, flying the jet they'd retired, saving men she didn't even know. Shadow 9, disengage. The colonel's voice broke through, strained and shaking. That's an order. Her response came low, resolute. Not until they're clear. Missiles streaked toward her as she banked wide. One clipped her wing, Smoke erupted, trailing behind like a scar reopened. The crew begged him to force her down, but he stood frozen, hand hovering over the comm switch. On radar, her signal dipped dangerously close to terrain. The colonel whispered, "Pull up, Elena, please." Instead, she dove lower, drawing enemy fire away from the convoy, turning herself into a decoy. Each round she fired seemed measured, personal. Every round counts. Her own words echoed through his mind from years ago, when she taught recruits never to waste life or ammunition. The last truck broke free from the valley, and the convoy's lead shouted, "We're clear." Then silence. The radar blinked red, altitude dropping fast. The feed flickered, then vanished. The command room stood still. For one crushing moment, it felt like losing her all over again. Then, through the static, a voice crackled faintly, Shadow 9 returning to base. Out of the rising smoke, a battered A-10 clawed its way back into view, limping but alive. The colonel pressed a trembling hand over his mouth, eyes glistening. Around him, hardened officers stood speechless. The ghost they'd buried had saved them all, and written her own resurrection in fire across the sky. The base lights burned through the fog as the battered A-10 scraped across the runway. One wheel missing, smoke curling from the fuselage. Fire crews chased its path, sirens wailing, the ground trembling under its dying engines. The jet finally came to a grinding stop near the hangar, flames licking its tail. For a moment, no one moved. Then the canopy hissed open. Through the haze, a figure emerged, helmet under one arm, limp in her step, uniform torn and streaked with blood and soot. Major Elena Ross was alive. The air seemed to freeze around her. Mechanics, medics, recruits, everyone on the tarmac stood still, as if afraid to blink and lose her again. The colonel stepped forward, his boots echoing against the concrete. 2 years of guilt and silence pressed against his ribs, heavy as armor. He had buried her once, carried her name like a wound that never healed. Now here she was, flesh, breath, and resolve, standing beside the same bird they'd once declared lost. She met his eyes but said nothing. For a long heartbeat, it was only the wind between them. Then he did what no one expected. He saluted first. The gesture cut through the crowd like a bell. Slowly, one by one, others followed. Mechanics with grease-stained hands, medics with torn gloves, even recruits who'd never known her story. Dozens of salutes rose across the tarmac until the whole base stood in silent tribute. The colonel's voice cracked as he whispered, "You brought them home." Elena's reply was quiet but firm. "That's what we're for." No speeches, no ceremony, just truth. Reporters who'd arrived late didn't need explanation. The sight said everything. The woman they'd buried had returned not for glory but for duty, defying death and command alike. As she walked past the line of saluting soldiers, the fading sunlight caught the scars on her jet, turning them gold. The colonel watched her go, shoulders straight, knowing that history would remember the mission, but he would remember the moment she made him believe again. True service, he realized, didn't ask for permission. It simply answered the call. Weeks passed, and the war moved on, as wars always do. Major Elena Ross refused every medal, every interview, every chance to stand in front of a camera. She said she'd already had her ceremony, the day her crew saluted her on the runway. Her A-10 was quietly towed into a museum hangar, its metal still scorched, its wings patched with pieces she'd welded herself. On the plaque beneath it was 6 words that said more than any speech could: Shadow 9, the angel returned. Visitors came and went, tracing fingers along its battered frame, not knowing the full story behind the burns and bullet holes. Sometimes, a man in a weathered officer's coat would stand there longer than most. The colonel, now retired, visited often, always alone. He'd stand before that silent jet and raise a slow salute, the same way he had on the day she landed. One afternoon, a young cadet approached him and asked quietly, "Sir, who was she?" The colonel smiled, eyes glassy but proud. Someone who never waited for permission to do what was right. Outside, the sun fell through the hangar windows, catching the jet scars in a soft glow. The narrator's voice fades in, gentle, reflective. Some heroes don't rise from books or parades. They rise from clouds, carrying the sound of engines and the weight of every life they saved. As dusk settles, the hum of an A-10 drifts faintly through the air, one last salute to the sky.